Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network at the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. And I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event on community engagement, protection, and peace, putting the nexus into action. But before we start, please note that you can listen to this event in English or French. Just go to the navigation panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the globe interpretation button, and then select the language channel that you'd like to use. Closed captions in English are also available, and you can access these by clicking on the button at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to share your thoughts and reflections in the chat. If you've got a question for our panel, please use the Q&A box to send these in, and I'll put them to the panel a little later on. And just a reminder that this event is being recorded. The video will be available on the ODI event webpage in a couple of days, and you'll also be able to listen to the discussion through the ODI event podcast channel. So let's get started. I mean, as we all know, the number of protracted non-international armed conflicts and the number and range of actors participating in them have significantly increased in the last 20 years. And this has posed challenges for humanitarian protection and peace actors who are trying to prevent, reduce, and respond to violence. And we know that civilian communities aren't just passive actors in conflict. The interaction between them and armed actors is complex, it's ambiguous, and it changes over time. And community engagement with armed actors often takes place well before any externally supported mediation or negotiation processes begin. And we also know that in recent years, many humanitarian and protection actors aren't proactively addressing threats to civilians in conflict, and they have only a limited focus on preventing or reducing risks, including of violence. Peace actors are more proactively engaged with threats, including through supporting dialogue, negotiation, and mediation with armed actors, but not necessarily through the lens of protection. But there's a growing recognition of the need for a shift in approaches to humanitarian protection, and to strengthen synergies between humanitarian protection and peace actors. And this requires putting the nexus into action by ensuring that these actors identify opportunities for joint learning and that they have honest conversations around the challenges and barriers to greater collaboration, as well as identify ways to overcome them. And this is because they're often working towards similar objectives, albeit with different approaches and ways of working. Ultimately, working in greater complementarity can lead to better outcomes for people affected by conflict. The recent humanitarian exchange, with its focus on community engagement around prevention, protection, and response, included articles from a range of humanitarian protection and peace-building practitioners and researchers as a first contribution in collating experience and developing a community of practice. So today's event brings together 4 of these authors in a discussion, which we hope will contribute to and influence the growing interest in how the nexus can be applied in conflict settings, and in particular, opportunities for greater complementarity between humanitarian protection and peace action. So now let's meet the panel. And first, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Gemma Davies. Gemma is a senior research fellow for the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, leading our portfolio of work on protection. And she has over 15 years of experience working with a range of international humanitarian and human rights organizations in numerous fragile and conflict-affected states. Gemma specializes in a range of issues, including protection of civilians, humanitarian negotiations, and forced displacement. And she's currently leading a 2-year research program at HPG on community engagement, protection, and peace. And I'm also very pleased to be joined by Habibo Bako, who is a policy officer for West Africa at Search for Common Ground. He works closely with Search for Common Ground's offices in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, and teams across West Africa. And prior to joining Search for Common Ground, Habibo was a human security research officer at the Institute for Security Studies in Senegal and Mali. And as a PhD researcher at the Abdou Moumouni University in Niamey, he was in charge of tutorials on security policies for master's students in international relations and Security Studies. And I'm also delighted to have Carla Ruta with us today. Carla is a legal advisor at Swiss Armed Forces, and she has 18 years of experience, including 10 with ICRC and 4 with Geneva Call, engaging armed state and non-state actors on international humanitarian and human rights law, and in developing and facilitating training and dissemination of international norms to communities, armed actors, civil society actors, and humanitarian practitioners in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. And Carla's also worked on community-based protection projects in a number of contexts and designed Geneva Call's community-based protection guidelines. And finally, last but not least, a warm welcome to Jerome Grimaud. Jerome is a humanitarian worker and a mediator specializing in protection of civilians through humanitarian negotiation, mediation, and dialogue facilitation, both as a practitioner and a trainer. And he's currently Senior Protection Advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council Standby Capacity Project, or ProCap. He also facilitates courses and training for humanitarian organizations and universities. So welcome to all of our panelists. And I'd like to begin today's session with a few questions for our panelists before moving on to your questions. And as I said earlier, please put them in the Q&A box. And I'm going to start with Gemma. Gemma, what is the role of communities in developing and shaping engagement with armed actors to strengthen their protection, and what factors affect this?
Thanks very much, Wendy. And as you said in your introduction, the agency of civilians and local communities in how violence plays out in conflict is often overlooked, including how they engage and seek to influence the behavior of armed actors. At times, communities may fuel violence against other civilians. At other times, communities are able to effectively engage with armed actors towards self-protection and to encourage restraint in the use of violence. We know that civilians think strategically about their engagement and adapt accordingly, depending on conflict dynamics, the type of armed actor, and the options open to them. And they can also leverage the presence of multiple armed actors to improve their protection. We also know that community perceptions of protection may differ to international actors, and whilst the latter might be focused on standards as defined by international law and access to rights, for civilian communities, customary values and norms are often far more important than formal rights. We also know that a range of local actors, from traditional religious and business leaders, elders, community-based organizations, can lead engagement on behalf of their respective communities. And understanding who is leading and present during negotiations is important, as these factors determine what concerns are prioritized. But we also need to remember that communities are not homogeneous. They're by nature diverse, continuously shifting groups. The distinction between civilian and armed actors isn't always clear. Pre-existing relationships based on kinship, ethnicity, family, and political ties can exist between the sets of actors, and it can offer civilians the advantage of trust over external actors in engaging with armed actors, or quite to the contrary. And these factors obviously are not uniform. For some, being embedded with or supportive of armed actors can be effective towards promoting self-protection. For others, being able to adopt a position of neutrality is key to strengthening protection. And there's other factors that can affect the terms of engagement too. So for armed actors, the motivation behind the use of violence, group ideology, the level of concern an armed actor has for its legitimacy can determine the boundaries of engagement. And for civilians, the level of internal community cohesion and capacity can be a key factor in effective engagement. Strong customary organization, a higher level of internal unity, and pre-existing respected local institutions or leadership can all improve the effectiveness of community engagement. And we also know that changes in conflict dynamics, power dynamics, and who is involved in communities negotiating with armed actors will all impact the positive and negative outcomes of engagement. So for example, in both South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, years of conflict has seen the emergence of different political military elites, which has in some cases reduced the influence of traditional forms of authority towards the use of violence or restraint. And we also know that levels of territorial control and changes in leadership of armed actors can also influence the potential success of engagement. I can't hear you, Wendy.
Sorry. I had a follow-up question. So I wanted to know, what do humanitarian and peace actors need to think about when they're considering supporting community engagement?
Yeah, I think primarily it's the fact that communities are the agents of their own protection, and they understand the risks and threats better than any external actor does. And their views and capacities must be central to decisions about if, when, and how these actors support engagement. I think it's important to note that humanitarian and peace actors should not presume that they have a role in supporting engagement. And when they see that there is a role and that's welcomed by communities, they could look to strengthen local capacities for self-protection and for engagement, and support community-devised strategies rather than replace them. And that also reflects the need for humanitarian and peace actors to better understand the complex dynamic interactions between communities and armed actors to inform how they support, engage, or step back in order to maximize the potential for such interactions to reduce civilian harm. External support to engagement must be tailored towards that sort of really granular, localized understanding of these dynamics and the communities that they seek to support. And I think also humanitarian and peace actors need to honestly consider the impact of their own activities and presence on conflict dynamics, and draw on that understanding to ensure their activities don't undermine or harm such dynamics and engagement. And while do no harm is a mantra of many humanitarian organizations, in practice, we're finding that many organizations fall short of that granular conflict analysis and truly conflict sensitive approaches to inform their activities. And lastly, there's a crucial need for humanitarian protection and peace actors to explore opportunities to working in greater complementarity and overcome barriers to doing so. I think, as you said at the beginning, there's growing recognition of the need to strengthen a community of practice between the sets of actors, learn from one another, and we hope that our research and indeed this conversation can contribute to this.
That's great. Thanks, Gemma. And I'm sure our other panelists will have other things to add as we get going in the discussion. But let me move to Habibu now. Habibu, you note in your article, which outlines Search for Common Ground's approach to peace building, that understanding, transforming, and doing no harm are the keys to effectively working in conflict zones. I wonder if you could tell us what conflict transformation actually means in practice, and what needs to be in place to effectively use conflict transformation approaches. I think you're on mute.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wendy, to the group for inviting me. Well, talking of conflict transformation, you need an approach, but you need also a kind of tool set to consolidate peace. And indeed, you have to think about local dynamics and the changing situation that the actors are in all the time. So the main idea is to make sure that the actors in a conflict change their ideas about humanitarian assistance and should be less confrontational and think about the more pacific side or peace sides of the conflict. Of course, managing all this is very difficult. The access of media, for example, is an example. And community actions, local actions, can help here. And what you have to do is to try and find ways which are adapted to resolving this kind of question. I worked mainly in the Sahel and in the Mali Basin, where the conflicts are really violent and they are growing. I can just take a small example. In Nigeria, where the farmers are actually responsible for more victims than the armed forces. So it really is important, as you said, to come up with a proper analysis of the role of the local players. So that has to be absolutely essential for local agents, actors. In terms of concrete action, and transformation there, it is important to get all the actors from different areas like religious leaders and so on, and to have a much broader based community discussion so that they can all be involved, to make sure they participate themselves. And it is very important that, the voices of everybody are heard, especially the ones who would normally be heard. An example of that is action which we participated in Sierra Leone, and we did an experiment with local actors and even actors who were actually using completely different approaches and who came together to discuss the questions. It is a question of bringing the local communities together and see how they can have an impact in managing the conflict, managing dialogue and so on. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Habibu. Also, I meant to say that
Merci beaucoup, Habibu.
For other panelists, that I'd be happy for you to come in if you have any comments that you want to make. Just feel free to jump in, because I think it's good to hear from others as well. But I'll move on to Carla for the moment. Carla, you interviewed civil society representatives from Cameroon, Lebanon, and Iraq on their reflections on engaging with armed actors over a number of years. And I wondered if you could tell us about what challenges and risks they said they encountered in engaging with armed actors, and what strategies did they use to address these? How did they effectively engage with them, and what factors contributed to successful engagement?
Thanks a lot, Wendy, and thanks a lot to the Humanitarian Policy Group for organizing this panel and for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Well, I think answering your question, I will a lot connect to what Gemma was saying in the beginning, because I think it's sort of, so she stated sort of extremely well sort of the general issues. And I think in the 3 interviews I had the pleasure to do, it was really shown in practice, what does that mean? So first, maybe before I enter into the details, to specify that in all 3 interviews, it was about longer term engagement, structured engagement with armed actors. It was not sort of one-off discussions of one community or community-based organization with an armed actor. And we really focus on engagement with armed non-state actors in a broader sense of a term. So it could also be paramilitaries, or but it's not as such armed forces. So just to clarify that in the beginning. So I think when we talk about challenges, and I would like to immediately also connect it with opportunities, because very often sort of somehow they can be linked. I think the first one would be an element that Gemma was already bringing up, is what is the relation between the community or the community-based organization with the armed actor? Does the armed actor consider them constituency or not? Or does their community feel close to the cause of the armed actor or not? This can be on one hand an advantage to engage, because you share values, you share a common cause, and the armed actor will not see you as an enemy, as an outsider coming to critique them. But on the other hand, it can also be a challenge, because when you critique the armed actor, you may be perceived also a bit as a traitor, because you're not really supporting the cause. You are, and so it can also make things very difficult for communities and community-based organizations to explain why they are insisting on certain protection measures to be taken by the armed actors. So it can have sort of this positive, but also this negative. Also to highlight that sometimes groups are not necessarily homogeneous. I mean, some are, but some are not. So it might be easier to engage with some parts of that group and with others and not at all, which does not necessarily make things easier. Another element that all the interviewees were also quite clearly bringing forward was the issue of the moment in time. When do you engage? Especially in the beginning of the conflict, many of them, or it's not necessarily the beginning of one armed conflict, it can be also sparking of violence or a new tension arising, that in that time it's of course quite difficult to engage. Maybe if it's a new conflict, people haven't really still felt the impact on their lives yet. So they don't really see why they should already start to engage. Maybe emotions are still extremely high. So yeah, one does not want to affect the cause, to speak against the cause. And then as the conflict drags on, the need to engage, the need to sit down with armed actors and discuss protection issue becomes sort of a bit more important also for communities. One other issue that they brought up is the issue of the different priorities that communities might have. If it's a very acute humanitarian situation, then it might be difficult for people to focus, where can I find food, where can I access health, maybe I need to flee a certain area, and at the same time construct or build a structured dialogue with an armed group might be a bit complicated and develop a whole strategy. So that was another challenge that interviewees brought up. And then when we talk about more about opportunities, then depending on how things evolve, if there is maybe a political process, a peace process, integration process into the army, for example, can all be elements where the armed actor will need more legitimacy, will want to show themselves from a good side, and where there might be a lot of entry point for communities and for community-based organization to enter and try to negotiate. And of course, another issue that they also all highlight is the issue of the structure of the group. Is there a clear chain of command? Do we know to whom we can talk to, or is it just some franchises here and there? And if I get agreement from a local commander, then the other commander is not going to abide by what we agreed. And so we need to restart again negotiations from scratch. So those a bit elements that, oh, maybe just one point to add. And this is also relating to something that, so sorry, that Gemma brought up, is how cohesive is the community. So is there sort of an accepted leadership, and everybody sort of agrees where negotiations should go to or what should be prioritized? And this is not necessarily always the case. There were interviewees that mentioned that suddenly what some community representative negotiated and was not accepted by the rest, so they had to restart. And then, of course, that made the whole process more difficult. So on how they engage, I think there are many different ways of engagement. Some were discussing directly with the armed group. In certain contexts, it might be too dangerous, too touchy, and then it will be easier to go through a contact person, maybe a religious leader, maybe somebody within local authorities, someone that has already some legitimacy with the armed actor to facilitate maybe the messages come across the right way. But they also stress that sometimes international NGOs can play that role, that sort of maybe have that outside legitimacy, and they can in certain cases play the role when they have already maybe gained some acceptance in a certain area, to precisely convey certain messages to the armed group. And then to wrap up, and you let me know if I forgot an element, then many of them had successes. And so it shows that it is possible. It's a very long-term effort. It's not something that is gained and then it's done and we can talk about something else. It's a never-ending process, but they had many successes, being, for example, in Iraq, facilitated return procedures for people that had been displaced, or a stop to child recruitment in Lebanon, or better, a clear decrease by certain groups of violence towards civilians, better conduct in hostilities, therefore less affecting civilians. So they do have success, but of course, yeah, it's one never knows when suddenly the conflict dynamic is going to affect those achievements, and discussions need to restart. And I'm going to stop now in order not to take too much time. Thank you.
That's great, Carla. Thanks for that. And I guess between those, among those three different contexts, there must be some quite distinct differences in terms of the risks and the challenges that your different interlocutors faced. Was there anything in particular that stood out for you in terms of that, or?
Yeah, I think that the contexts are extremely different, and therefore the different actors went about approaching the different armed actors in very different ways. I think if we think about Lebanon is sort of quite a contained, even though it's many people, but it's sort of a rather contained community. It's not sort of an extremely vast region. So people know each other, people know who is who. That has some advantages, but also some disadvantages. But sort of to create certain dynamics, make it a bit easier. In Cameroon, I think there were very different dynamics, I mean, very different groups. But I think this is something maybe they share with Iraq, even though it's also a totally different context, but sort of having to deal with very different groups, some quite small, so close to communities where dialogue was easy, some becoming bigger, and where the contacts were more difficult. And there were, in Cameroon, they were especially stressing the challenges with regard to priorities of communities, some close also to the groups, others not, and sort of how to, as a community-based organization, civil society organization, how to handle with those that say, oh, you're too close to this part and you're not enough close to this part. And I think Iraq, probably the place where I felt there was most, how to say, probably mistrust and caution that needed to be applied, and need for intermediaries, and in order not to get into trouble. Probably more than in the other contexts where I felt, I mean, that is now sort of a feeling from the interviews, that it was more difficult to find the right entry points and the right contact person, and direct engagement was quite delicate.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Really interesting. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Jerome now. Jerome, you're an experienced humanitarian practitioner and mediator. And I wondered if you could first tell us what humanitarian mediation is, and then talk us through the experience of using humanitarian mediation in the Central African Republic. I mean, I think we're particularly interested in what lessons were learned that others who might engage in humanitarian mediation need to think about.
Thank you, Wendy. Regarding the first question, humanitarian mediation is a voluntary and inclusive process where a third party, neutral and impartial, facilitates the communication and the collaboration between parties who are either involved or affected by conflict, in order for them to find mutually acceptable solution by themselves. So I stress that it's a voluntary process. People come because they think it's the right thing to do. It's inclusive, so it's not only the actors feeling the conflict, but also those who are affected, who are a part of the discussion, and they find the solution by themselves. So the mediator only facilitates that discussion. At no times the mediator will judge or advise or get into the content of the discussion. This is the responsibility of the parties. And maybe a few words on the Central African Republic context at that time, because it's back in when the last outbreak of violence started in 2013, 2014, where a political military conflict turned into a communal conflict between two communities. I would mention them as Christian and Muslim communities, though I want to stress that it was not a religious conflict. At that time, the Danish Refugee Council was involved in social cohesion programming. And when the outbreak of violence started, social cohesion, which is about living together, was either too late or too early. Too late because it could have prevented maybe the escalation of violence, or too early because when violence occurs, it's not anymore about living together. It's about being safe from violence. It's being protected. So we decided to find a way to mitigate episodes of violence. There were many ways to do that. Some decided to organize evacuation of communities in Cameroon, in Chad. That's a way to actually protect people in a way. But we know that once people are relocated, possibly, it takes on average 17 years for them to come back if they want to come back. So that's an option. International military intervention is another option. But CAR is a very huge country. So how do you protect physically people in such a huge country? We could have chosen also negotiation, but when you negotiate on behalf of a community, then you are seen as sided, very oftentimes. So, and then you are seen as sort of, taking side and being part of the conflict cycle. So mediation is one among all those options that can be promoted to protect civilians. We have chosen that one because we think it's the most empowering, because it allows for people to make their own diagnostic of what are the problems to be solved in order for the situation to calm down, in order for them to be more safe, and also to find the solution for themselves. I'll take maybe the example of one location, Boda, on which a research is being undertaken now, and I have a few data on them, on the research. So Boda is a town in Lobais, southwest of Kor. And at that time, it was also a location of enclave, about between 11,000 and 15,000 Muslims were trapped, surrounded by hostile groups, and they were surrounded by a so-called red line, and crossing that red line would expose them to the risk of immediate death. So the protection cluster, knowing that these humanitarian mediation interventions were ongoing, said that it could be an option for Boda. And they said that if it was to fail, then they would evacuate the Muslim community members to another location where they could be safer. So we started that process, which lasted a year, with different phases, and which started with a conflict-sensitive analysis, a bit like Abibu presented, and then with pre-mediation, meaning separate meeting with different actors in order to prepare them to the dialogue. Remember, it's a voluntary process. And first there was a no, we don't want to meet. We are not ready to meet. And we respected that, of course. But there was a common concern, and that common concern in both communities was security. So parallel dialogues were undertaken, facilitated on security in both communities separately. And that led to plan of action, that led to reduction of violence. And at some stage, members of those dialogues said, it's time to meet. And there were disagreements, so it was not yet the time. But they were ready to exchange the minutes of their meeting, first contact. And few weeks down the line, few months down the line, they were ready to meet. I'm short of time, so I'll jump to maybe 2 years later. 2 years later, the situation was such that international forces left Boda. And to my knowledge, they have not returned since then. Knowing that CAR is not at peace, as we know, but this location has remained. And there are multiple factors. It seems that in the research, they identified this intervention as one of them. But I will end saying that this process is, again, only one of the multiple options we have as humanitarians to promote better protection. And sometimes it's not appropriate, and sometimes parties are not ready, so we need to find something else. So and maybe we'll have more time to discuss that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in at this point from the panel with any comments. I mean, I'm just wondering whether any of you have been in situations where the possibility of entering into or supporting such mediation existed, but you made a decision not to do that, and why that would have been the case. Jerome, I mean, we'll go to you first. Has that been an experience that you've had, or under what circumstances do you think it wouldn't be appropriate to engage?
When the parties are saying no, when they are saying, I can share that with you, but I can't share that with the other, that would put me at risk. So really feeling the pulse of the community members. They know if they can go on or not. They know if they would face a risk or not, and be respectful of that. It's not because we have a program that this program has to run. This is our tempo. This is our pulse, but we don't care about that. It's about them. That's one instance. Another instance is when there are too many actors, because then it's very confusing, too many processes, and then the actors start playing one process against the other, so when it's too busy, too packed, no, there are other places where there is nobody, so let's go for it. But I think when there are too many actors, it's not a good thing to continue.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Because I'm also interested, Jerome, in your thoughts about other approaches to promoting protection. Whether you had any reflections on other approaches, some of which you've mentioned in your chat so far.
Yeah, well, I don't want to take too much time. So Carla and Abibou, please feel free to jump in. No, but what I think is that as humanitarian, we are focusing too much on remedial action, environmental building action for protection, when in many instances, what people are concerned about is their immediate security and safety. So it's very good that we are able to ship tons of food ration in a location, but this is not what is at stake for people. It's their ability to move freely, to be safe in their house, in their homes, and we have to hear that and adapt to that. I think if we were to look at let's say the investment we make in remedial action and in actually proactive, preventative protection, I think it's negligible. The second is negligible. So I think it's our responsibility to be much more proactive in thinking, what can we do? It can be mediation, it can be a negotiation for protection, it can be civil military. So in some last resort instance, it could be evacuation. But we have to open that box of proactive protection and be creative about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Carla, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to answer your question, and reading Jérôme's article, I think that there was something, because your question was originally, have you done mediation? And so my answer is no. And one of the reasons is mentioned in Jérôme's article, where he said that we often sort of consider we are not sufficiently skilled and don't have the expertise. So we say, oh, no, we are not going to do that. And I think that is one of the reasons nowhere where I was that we really engaged in mediation, because we felt we are no mediators. And another reason also Jérôme touched upon is sort of the long-term perspective. And I think as humanitarian actors, very often we go in, we deliver something, and then we say, oh, I don't know, there was they burned some houses, or maybe we discuss the issue of the burned houses, and then we move out and we go to the next village. And we're sort of a bit shy of the idea of let's stay for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years around to discuss one topic, and not sort of, because there is also detainees, and there is also maybe child recruitment, and there is this and that. And so we try to do many things, and maybe sometimes we try to do too many things. I mean, it's of course awfully difficult to prioritize sometimes, because many humanitarian issues are worthy of attention, and it's not, oh, this is less important than that. But maybe to go for something more long-term, more sort of in a more contained area, could reach more results than this sort of short-term input here and there.
Great, thank you for that. Habibou.
Oui, merci Wendy. J'aimerais juste enchaîner.
Thank you. I would just like to.
Jérôme s'est arrêté parce que
Quand
on prend la médiation, ce qui est très important,
mediation, what is very important,
il faut voir, c'est au-delà des accords, des signatures, des mémorandums d'entente. Qu'est-ce que les
memorandums of agreement?
Il a mentionné quelque chose de très important sur le fait que ça doit venir de la communauté. Les acteurs qui ont le programme mettre en œuvre doivent juste être des simples facilitateurs. Peut-être apporter des simples outils dont ces communautés-là n'ont pas et qui vont adapter à leur propre culture, être des leaders en termes de médiation dans leur communauté. L'exemple que je connais le plus, c'est celui d'un programme que nous avons mené dans la région de Tilaberi au Niger. Nous avons travaillé avec des acteurs communautaires, des leaders, des jeunes et des leaders traditionnels, eux-mêmes puissent identifier d'abord les conflits lesquels ils veulent travailler, sur les conflits sur lesquels ils veulent voir la médiation intervenir, pas ceux sur lesquels peut-être nous avons bâti notre programme. Et nous avons travaillé avec ces acteurs pour renforcer leur capacité dans un premier temps, mais aussi leur donner l'opportunité de pouvoir se déplacer par exemple à d'autres pour pouvoir discuter des problèmes. J'avais mentionné les problèmes d'accès à l'eau, les problèmes d'utilisation des ressources locales. Donc, c'est vraiment très important dans un premier temps de donner les capacités aux communautés locales et non pas venir se servir aussi juste de médiateur entre ces communautés. Et à long terme aussi, le résultat que ça donne, c'est que à long terme, ils ont la capacité de poursuivre ce travail, même sans ce programme-là. J'ai un autre exemple, mais je ne sais pas si on a le temps, hein, Wendy. Oui, donc l'autre point que j'aimerais mettre de l'avant aussi, c'est le fait que la médiation au niveau communautaire doit laisser des choses qui créent des connexions à long terme entre les communautés.
Long-term connections.
Et c'est ce que nous appelons à chercher l'interdépendance économique entre les communautés locales.
The economic interdependence between local authorities, local communities rather.
Au niveau de la région de Sikasso, dans le sud-ouest du Mali, où
for example, in the southwest of Mali,
de l'ampleur, il y a un village
there. There's a village there
les communautés ont du mal à participer au même marché
Where
parce que tout simplement, il y a les conflits entre eux. Nous avons travaillé avec
communities
les groupes
have great
pour les
difficulty
amener
actually
à voir
participating
effectivement
because
ce
there isn't any
marché
trust.
est un bien commun et qui peut rester, et qui peut
We
en
did
termes de
actually get through to them,
et c'est la même approche que nous utilisons quand il s'agit de
and
la
that's the
constitution des
same
infrastructures
approach
sociales
that we
locales.
used.
Leur
I'm sorry, the
objectif
sound
est
isn't very good.
de permettre tout simplement aux communautés de se sentir autour de quelque chose qui les unit. Donc, c'est ces deux exemples-là que j'aimerais
So
partager.
those two examples I just wanted to share with you.
Ensuite,
The
après,
interpreter
very much.
apologizes, but the sound wasn't very good.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. We seem to have a problem with our dulling the sound on one or the other, but thank you. I hope most people got that. That was really interesting. I was trying to listen in between. Gemma, we want to move on to questions from the audience because we've got a few interesting ones coming in, but go ahead briefly.
Yeah, no, just to say very briefly, and just to sort of re-emphasize what Jerome and Carla were saying, I think the humanitarian community writ large really need to consider that balance on prevention and reduction of violence. So as so-called preventative protection, as opposed to this environment and remedial environment building and remedial approaches. And I think that also requires sort of really getting around this sort of one size fits all approach. It has to be something that is grounded within the local context, the local dynamics, and built up from that. But I won't take up too much time, so we can get to comments from the audience. Thanks.
No, important points, Gemma. Let me start with some questions, some of your questions from the audience. I've got one here, which is an interesting one. At a time when humanitarian and peace building budgets are already squeezed, what is the panel's experience and recommendations with how humanitarians, especially UN and donors, can create more flexibility in processes and timelines for community engagement and leadership around protection and peace building? Did everybody get that, or shall I read it again? No, you want me to read it again, Jerome? Yeah, okay. At a time when humanitarian and peace building budgets are already squeezed, what is the panel's experience and recommendations and with how humanitarians, especially UN and donors, can create more flexibility in processes and timelines for community engagement and leadership around protection and peace building? Who'd like to have a go? Jerome.
Yes, I would say that those processes that have been described, they are not the most expensive. They don't require much logistics. Basically, it's about training. It's about being able to move from one place to another. It's about having a flip chart and markers that works. But I mean, compared to shipping food to a location or building a hospital, because people are in an enclave, so they can't go to their hospital. So you need to create health facilities within the enclave. That's extremely expensive. So in comparison, community engagement involves very little. That's one thing. So it's not costly. Second thing is that there are donors who are able to hear that, look, we ask you to fund us for something we are not sure will happen, because it depends on the willingness of the communities to get involved. They are the one deciding if they want to be part of this process. And there are some, also because their budgets are relatively limited, that are ready to do that. And I can mention the Scandinavians, but also the Swiss. It's not the case for everyone, but I want to mention that there are donors that are open to that.
Thank you, Jerome. Carla.
Thank you. No, it's true that, I mean, having worked for a donor and for humanitarian organizations, it's true that there is this openness, but between openness and implementing the openness, sometimes I faced it was a bit difficult. So we were also, as I worked, for example, for the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then we had the idea of more long-term funding or less earmarked funding, sort of bigger sort of envelopes. But then when we came to sign contracts, and I realized this again, then working for humanitarian actors, then it's suddenly not that easy, sort of going from the talk to them. I don't remember how you say that in English, but then really implementation, it's not always necessarily that easy. And one always prefers to have sort of concrete results, and then you can say we delivered so many tons of this, and also in protection we visited so many prisoners and so many prisons, and this is so much more easy to say, yeah, we had a good first year, but probably it's going to be 5 more years, and we don't know what's going to happen at the end. It's not always very easy to sell, and coming back to the interviews, I had the chance to say this is also one of the challenges that especially one civil society organization brought up, is sort of that it was difficult, probably even more so for them than for INGOs to find funding for that. And it was easier if they did some distribution to say, oh, we are going to engage with our non-state actors, and sort of, oh my God, what are you going to do there? And you're a local actor, so for sure the money is going not to be used in the right way. So I guess also there may be not necessarily always the same situation for, I guess it depends on the context, but between INGOs and some local actors.
Jerome, do you want to say something quickly, and then we'll move on to the next question?
If you allow me, Wendy,
Yeah.
I'd like to come back to one point that Abibu mentioned about training communities themselves, because I think it's a very important point. I think depending of the phase of the conflict we are in, it can be possible very often to find a trusted insider, mediators within the community who have the trust. And they are very, very important. They play an important role in diffusing tension when rumors or tension are escalating. When there is a trigger of violence, they can still calm down the situation. When we are at the peak of violence, sometimes those trusted insiders, they themselves take side because they are impacted. Sometimes it happens. And when they don't, sometimes they are being asked to choose one side. Now it's not the time for the dialogue anymore. You are with us or you are against us. Mm-hmm. So I think it can be good to have all options open. I mean, trusted insider, national from another province or another region of the country, or internationals from the same continent, or international from another continent, with a set of skills which is similar, speaking the same language, but who will, it gives more options to get the trust. Who will get the trust, we don't know. It could be someone from the communities, it could be someone from another community, it could be someone from another country. And that trust building cannot be set in advance, if I can put it that way. So having all those options open can be interesting, in my view.
Great, thanks for that. I'm going to move us on to another question. There are many interesting ones coming through here, so I want to get to as many as we can. There's a couple here about thinking about the title of the event and with a nexus in it. Is there a clear example of a successful collaboration between protection actors working within the traditional humanitarian community if we can call it that, and those being associated with the peace sector. I wonder if any of you can speak to that question. And someone else has asked a related question about, what's the role for protection actors, especially in humanitarian mediation. Any takers? Carla.
I'm not sure that I'm the one here having most experience in that field, but sort of just to launch on a response. I never worked closely with peace promotion actors as such, but where I felt that there were very interesting interconnections and where we could really work sort of in a complementary way, even if we were not necessarily always together in the same room, was, for example, when I was working with Geneva Call and the peace process between the FARC and the Colombian government. And sort of we were working on humanitarian measures, humanitarian protection measures that, for example, the FARC could take, like demining, like releasing children they had recruited, etc., and which at the same time were not only as such protection measures and trying to respect IHL, but were also trust building measures in the peace process. And they were also seen by everybody as such, and the discussions also that, for example, the FARC had with peace building actors were sort of reinforcing sort of this understanding of implementing some protection measures, how this could help in building trust and in furthering the peace process beyond the protection issue as such. So there, I found the collaboration very, very interesting. But I will let Habibu answer, who for sure has more experience in that field than me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carla. Habibu, please go ahead.
So I see that there was an issue with the translation. Now, is this fine now?
Yes, we can hear you. I'm sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened, but go ahead if you're happy to speak in English.
So maybe one example I want to share is the fact that sometimes there is a kind of really separate actions when it's come for humanitarian development or peace actors to implement separately activities. But I think one of the entry points today is really the conflict sensitivity. Even if you implement a WASH program, for example, in central Mali, regarding education, you need to know how is these infrastructures fitting with local dynamic and local conflicts. So one of the work really we do here in Mali, for example, and a study we conducted after one humanitarian development organization conduct and projects was to conduct the research with them to know how these local infrastructure, for example, are governed. Is this governance around if it is access to water, how is it in terms of local power dynamic also, and how is it reducing violence and conflict or increasing tensions? So I think conflict sensitivity today is really an entry point for both humanitarian development and peace actors to have at least one seat on which they can stay. And in Mali, I really think that the conflict sensitivity approach can be a success to implement the nexus.
Thanks for that, Habiba. An important point. Gemma.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think there are some examples of collaboration, and I know that in the chat there's been some conversations over South Sudan. I think this particularly is one country and one of many, I'm sure, where there's sort of quite a lot of thinking around this. I guess, you know, we also need to think of, so where there's positive collaborations, I think, as you say, Habiba, I completely agree, it's around sort of the entry point on conflict sensitivity. And I think also sort of, as you said at the beginning, Wendy, quite often peace actors are engaging a lot more in sort of so-called, you know, dialogue, prevention, negotiation, even though not through the lens of protection. And humanitarians have been less so on the preventative side. But we are seeing those examples. I think some of the issues, though, is where that becomes very projectized. So actually where there's some really interesting engagement is where there's been dialogue that's based on a situation, so an escalation of violence, working with various different ethnic groups or conflict parties to say, you know, what would it take to prevent violence or reduce violence, and really taking sort of forward a dialogue on a longer term discussion that everyone's involved with. I think where the issue falls is obviously sort of quite different ways of working, and where this becomes, you know, a projectized initiative. So it's looking for ways to have those sort of, if you like, safe spaces for dialogue and make sure that they're around the situation. So exactly as Habibu said, conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity analysis in particular, and where the various different sets of actors can get around that and contribute. Because I think there's also a bit of a misunderstanding of the real contributions that the various sets of actors can make, and, you know, working together, how those can be better built on and emphasized. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Gemma. Jerome.
Yeah, I can take the example of CAR again, not saying it was a successful one, just saying how it was. What we noticed in CAR is that peace and dialogue actors had a more development profile, let's say. And when violence happened, they stopped first their activities or withdrawn, as if it was a time for humanitarian action. That was a bit like that. And then they came back afterwards when it was calmer. And I think actually they should be when violence occurs, because they have the skills, because they are trained, because they know how to approach that. Except, I would say, for Search for Common Ground, who was there all along, and which has, I think, both this development and emergency kind of approach, I would say. But that was, I think, one of the exceptions. But I want to say that there was a strong dialogue at that time between when MINUSCA deployed, between the Civil Affairs Department and some NGOs involved in proactive protection, including negotiation and mediation, and even DPA, the Department of Political Affairs, which was quite interesting, because then you have this 3 tracks approach where you look at violence at community level, but also political agreement, and how all these things go together or not, or sometimes together and sometimes not. But that was not systematic. It was just because the people who were there at that time willing to speak to each other. There was no set forum or a system by which peace actors, humanitarians would speak together, trying to address the same issue. And that is missing, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So we need to have a forum or a mechanism, or we need to be conscious that needs to happen somehow. Okay, thank you for that. I want to ask just, we've got so many questions, and apologies if we don't get to you all today, but I've got one here from Anne Malloy from ICRC in Northern Ireland, asking if the panelists have been involved in initiatives or networks to strengthen the capacity of local negotiators and what that's involved. And she says ICRC have been supporting a network of community negotiators for a number of years in Northern Ireland and working with the Center for Competence in Humanitarian Negotiation in supporting them. So I don't know if anybody'd like to speak to that. Jerome.
Yes. After the intervention, again in CAR, which has, I mean, all in all, lasted almost 3 years, a little bit more than that, the national colleagues who are trained to facilitating mediation have set up a national network of mediators. So they have set their own, I would not say organization because it's not as formal as that, but they have set themselves as a group of trained mediator in CAR. So it's a very informal way of supporting local mediation networks, but it's happening and they are still active. They are still a resource for that country. So this is what I can share.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? Well, I've got, oh, Carla, sorry, go ahead. Your hand was obscured in the corner of your screen.
First, maybe to refer to the experience of one of the interviewee from Cameroon who has been doing that, training people in communities on engagement with armed actors on protection issues. They have done that in a number of communities, providing them with tools and help them develop their strategy, giving them material. I also had the chance in another context in Bangladesh, where we have also been working with civil society actors that have had a long-term engagement with a number of armed actors to precisely work with them on tools for negotiations, on how to develop a negotiation strategy, how to best engage on norms. And this has been extremely interesting experiences also on that occasion to learn also from the people in the field having done then that engagement and get their feedback and what works and what does not work. Thank you.
Really interesting. Habibu.
Yes, thank you. So really in terms of mediation, one of the points also we take into account from our side is to make sure that the people that will talk with local mediators also are maybe from their country or can understand also the culture to facilitate this dialogue. For example, in each country office from Niger to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, for example, for the West Africa, we make sure that we have capacity of internal mediation. One concrete example is after Ogosagu events between two communities that clash, we launched a project that's really was conducted. The first idea was to come to bring this community together to sign an agreement. But in the implementation of the projects, we understand that what they need is not just an agreement, but a dialogue and understanding each other. They had been living together for several years. It's not just a paper that can make it, but really a more deepened. So, but we cannot achieve this without a person internally for sure, but also people that can understand the local culture. So this is a point I just want to add in terms of the content of our approach to mediation.
Thanks very much, Habibu. We've got about 15 minutes left in our session, which is amazing to me. It's gone so quickly. But before we finish, I did want to ask all of the panelists a final question, and I think we'll allow enough time now, if we ask this now, for everybody to respond. And I think it covers a couple of the other questions that people have asked as well in the chat or in the Q&A. And that question is, how can international humanitarian and peace actors better support the more central and systematic involvement of communities in engaging with armed actors to improve protection and peace outcomes? So we're talking about, supporting the central and systematic involvement of communities in this. So can I have your reflections on that, please? And I'd put your little hand up if you'd like to go first. Gemma.
I can start off. I think quite a lot of it's been said, but I think honestly there needs to be a mindset shift in the humanitarian sector. And I think, Jerome alluded to this earlier on sort of focusing on really where there are impacts on civilian communities at the local level. Some of the most profound results in terms of sort of outcomes towards improved safety and security come from these sort of really localized approaches based on what is happening within the community at that time in that place, and the dynamics at play. But that is, while it might be low cost in terms of finances, it requires long-term approaches and investments. And I think, in order to then really centralize communities within that, we've got to sort of get around this sort of humanitarian need, and this is across organizations, donors, all agencies involved, to demonstrate results, activities in the short term and really focus on outcomes, even if they're at a very localized level. And I think also we've got to be a lot more honest about what we're able to achieve, but equally where we may fail, and be quite honest that there is a risk of that, but at the same time, a really sort of calculation as to, the willingness to take that risk. And then I think it also requires giving up space. I think, a lot of humanitarian organizations give a lot of, if I might say, state a lot around sort of their willingness to support communities. But I guess, again, we need to really honestly ask ourselves, are we willing to listen? And if we are willing to also listen to those voices, are we willing to act on them? And I think until we've really sort of thought that through as a community and being quite honest with ourselves and with our donors, then that systemic shift, we might still fall behind. And that again sort of will always, I think, sort of speaks to the fact that, that accountability down that our sector talks about so often, really what's the balance of that accountability to affected people and integrating the voices of affected people to, our donors, our funders, our programs, our cycles, etc. And I think, there just has to be a lot more honesty around getting around that. And I think, as one person we've spoken to in the course of the early stages of this research said, we need to ask the question, is it worth having, 100 small interventions that achieve results as opposed to 10 interventions that may not? So perhaps there's also a need to rethink about this big question of scale that's driven the sector over the last years. I'll finish there and make space for the others. Thanks.
Thank you, Gemma. Carla.
Yeah, so I, of course, completely agree with what Gemma just said. And maybe to add that I think the problem is at all levels, from the individual humanitarian workers to the top level of humanitarian institutions, that we think in silos, not only of humanitarian, but I'm part of that organization and I implement the programs of my organization, and this is my priority. And yeah, I know there is a world around me, but I just have to implement my things. And I think, yeah, as Gemma said about listening, and it's not now suddenly wanting to shove communities to go and do engagement and and then we don't have to do it, or then we can tick the box and say, oh, we are so great because we have communities do the engagement. But it's just really to just listen, to sit there.
Vraiment écouter, de prendre le temps de comprendre quels sont leurs besoins, qu'est-ce qu'ils font, qu'est-ce qu'ils souhaitent accomplir, qu'est-ce qu'ils souhaitent faire.
How there we can fit in, maybe we don't. Maybe we come to the conclusion that
peut-être que nous avons la conclusion que la communauté a
something completely different, and that is fine, but we don't really take the time to see, okay, maybe they need support, maybe we can have a complementary approach, maybe we can do some training, maybe they can train us, because there are so many things that we don't know. So I just really starting by just sitting down and really listening, and not just to tick boxes, because that's another danger that we can have, and see all the different complementarities that can emerge.
No, really good points. I think listening is something that we don't always do very well. Jerome.
Yes, I can only second and agree with Gemma and Carla. Listen. And I'm a bit sad that we all agree on that, and we are not in the 1950s, we are in the 2023, and we still have to repeat this because we don't do it. So, I mean, one key question for me is, how would you feel more protected? How would you feel more protected? And that means, what are the threats you are facing? What are the causes behind the threats? Who are the actors behind the threats? When it's occurring, at what frequency, where? What do you do to keep safe from that? What do you think should be done? And I agree with Carla, then that could involve community only. That could involve community and us. That could involve us or other actors. That we don't know. We cannot set it in advance. But having that key question in mind, how would you feel more protected and be ready to act on the answer they will give us? If not, then maybe we are not ready to get involved in protection. Maybe we are not, and then we have to accept that, and we have to say it. But I think that key question for me is central to our action. How would you feel more protected?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very important, and I think the point you make about whether we're prepared to act or not on what we hear is an important one, or whether we have the capacity to do that. And it's a question that runs through the whole accountability discussion as well. We can collect feedback, and we might even be listening sometimes, but can we actually act on it? Habibu.
Yes, thank you, Gemma. I really agree with all the points highlighted by speakers. Just maybe one point is the fact that I think it is time to learn from each other. It is time today to have more collaborative approach and inclusive discussion and network that's give opportunity for learning from what is done and evaluating also maybe what are we achieving. So from the peace building perspective, we come, for example, with what we call the peace impact framework that can help to evaluate what we are achieving. And that is narrowed down around how our interventions can reduce physical violence, increase personal agency, reduce polarization, and also help institutional legitimacy and guide and support donors also to do to shift their investments. So this is maybe the point I just want to finish on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Habibu. Also very important points, and bringing in the donor perspective as well. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, and I know that we're going to have to close the session right on time because they're going on to the next one. First, I'd just like to apologize for the problems we've had over the translation, and I hope that most of you were able to get most of the discussion. So I'm very sorry about that. But I wanted to thank everybody very much, our panelists for their participation and contributions, and also to all of you who've sent in questions and comments in the chat and in the Q&A. And apologies if we haven't got to all of your questions, but I hope that you found the discussion interesting. For me, it's been a really rich and interesting discussion. The recording is going to be available in a couple of days, as I said earlier, on the event webpage. And you can find a link in the chat box to the Humanitarian Exchange magazine on community engagement with armed actors, which was co-edited by Gemma and to which all of our panelists have contributed. So I wanted to say thank you again, and we will hopefully see you in another HPG event soon. Goodbye.